maintain the momentum and maybe look at some of the areas. And one of the key areas is revenues. Now you've seen, I quoted before that Nigeria has one of the lowest revenue to GDP ratios in the world. I think you are just ahead of maybe Sudan and Yemen. So, and it's a country of 220 million people. So your revenue to GDP ratio in 2022 was 6.7%. In 2023, after the subsidy removal as well for the half year, you're going to maybe average around 9%, that's what our estimate. But that's our estimate, like with the estimation that the revenues from the subsidy removal flow in fully. We're not really seeing that right now. If you look at the two bars at the end, the 2022 big bar and the 2023 big bar, revenue, especially federation revenue, FAC revenues, have stayed stagnant at 2.5% of GDP between the Jan to August. Now, what happens when revenue continues to remain stagnant? When revenues remain stagnant, you need to increase your debt, or you need to continue borrowing because to finance your expenditures. So interest payments continue to rise, right, because you have taken on debt. And so as those rise, your expenditure needs rise. When your expenditure needs rise, your revenues are remaining stagnant, you need to borrow more, your interest payments rise, and you're kind of stuck in a circle, like a cycle. Now, another problem that Nigeria is facing, it's not only that it's borrowing more, it's where it's borrowing from. Given that the rigidities of your budgeting systems, any change to the budget, for example, if you projected 100 as your revenue, and in-year revenues end up being 80. Now you have two options. Well, there are two options the government uses, you only have one option. But the first option is you can go back to the parliament, change your budget and say, look, our revenues fell short mid-year, and we would like to take on more debt from the domestic market, from the international market. However, that's usually a long, lengthy process, and you have to go back and forth between NAS and the executive. The second option that the government seems to be using increasingly is going to the CBN. And we have seen ways and means, which is borrowing from the central bank, increasing. So your budgeted fiscal balance is always a certain number. Your actual fiscal deficit, federal government, has consistently been higher. So, it says it's fiscal balance, so it's fiscal deficit. Your fiscal deficit is always higher than what you budget. As a result, you end up borrowing from the central bank at an increasing rate, and that borrowing is extremely expensive. It is at about 21% right now. It's usually MPR plus 3% with a one-year tenor. 1 year, you have to repay it in 1 year, and it kind of accumulates. You had the securitization done in June of 22.7 trillion, which was a huge stock of your ways and means that was securitized onto more sustainable, cheaper terms, which was a good step from a fiscal perspective. But after that, the exercise of borrowing from the central bank has continued. And this is not only distortionary from a financial perspective, from an economic perspective, it's also extremely inflationary. Central bank is printing money to finance the federal government, or it's taking money from the banking sector in terms of higher cash reserve ratios at zero cost and lending it to the federal government. Either way, it's not the best way for Nigeria to finance its expenditure. So, as mentioned before, Nigeria remains one of the lowest revenue to GDP ratios, and raising that revenue, both oil and non-oil, remains critical. If you see the red line, that's the sub-Saharan Africa average, around 18% of GDP. Nigeria, even over the medium term, is going to remain under 10%, even with these reforms. So there needs to be an acceleration of reforms. Something that Joseph has also highlighted before, the FX market continues to be volatile. Now, we saw the circular come in October from the central bank. We saw a reaffirmation of the willing buyer, willing seller model. We saw 43 items ban removed, which helps remove the fragmentation. But you still have this massive parallel market premium, which is about 40 to 50% right now in the past couple of days. So there's something that's happening, and most of that's happening is a lack of confidence in the market. So there's definitely a need for the central bank specifically, and of course the federal government as well, to build that confidence back up so that your foreign investors start coming in, your foreign portfolio inflows start coming in, and that you start seeing bit of stability in the naira. And then we have seen of course, you have already all borne the cost of the petrol price increases, about 160% between pre and post subsidy removal, and about how much? 200% plus for over a year-on-year average. Now you saw the estimates that the petrol price increases, but you've seen the naira depreciate. You've seen global oil prices rise. But the pump price has stayed the same. So what we're not completely sure is the subsidy back, which is obviously not a result we want to see. Like, all the Nigerians have borne this humongous cost. You don't want to be taking steps backwards to go back towards something that is going to be unsustainable. And right now we think about, our estimates show that the light blue line is if the official exchange rate was used, the official one that's reported in NAFEM, the price of the pump should be around 750 naira per litre on average across Nigeria. And it's currently around 600 to 650. So it's about 100 naira difference that we can't seem to reconcile. So our question is the subsidy back? Because the government says it's not. What we're seeing in our estimates is that it's back, and that's not a good thing to see, because that makes us fearful that we might see Nigeria going back to its old habits, which we don't want, because you've already all borne the costs of it. So what now? Like, we've talked about the costs, we've talked about the reforms that were taken, we've talked about the costs of those reforms, extremely painful, and we've talked about what more needs to be done. So this is just us highlighting what more should Nigeria, over the next 6 months at least, should be thinking about doing. First is the naira stability. We have seen the naira going, at least in the parallel marking, depreciating by over 200 nairas actually, over the dollar increasing in price for over 200 nairas in the past 2 weeks only. So, and we see the premium going up and down on almost a daily basis. So we need basically an FX policy that restores confidence in the market. We want to see a tighter monetary policy, maybe that's the answer. We have seen the MPC being postponed twice already. We now finally have good news that it's going to be taken in February, late February. So that's a good news that finally we see that central bank is going to articulate a clear policy. So that might help. We need to see, maybe ways and means needs to be fully, like a commitment needs to be made from both the federal government and the CBN to follow the law and actually remove ways and means, because that would cut back on inflationary pressures, again build confidence in the market. And of course, a lot of these things that the central bank has already started to say. We have heard commitments to reduce ways and means. We have heard commitments to phase out the development finance scheme. So they're on the right track. It's just about keeping that momentum going on FX. So the other thing we would like to see is the cost, like more clarity on what's happening at the petrol prices. We want to know how the pump price is being determined. When the subsidy was first removed, we saw more entrants coming to the market to import PMS. And that was a good thing. You would have competition in the market. You would see market, doing well. That's best for consumers. However, once the depreciation of the naira started happening, NNPC became again the sole importer of PMS. And that's again not in the interest of the consumers of petrol, because now NNPC is controlling it, and they are getting maybe a favorable exchange rate, maybe because they do the swaps of oil. So they get a favorable exchange rate. So we need a little more clarity on the NNPC front on how pump prices are being fixed, how the pump prices are being determined. It gives clarity. It helps people manage their commutes. So it would just be so that would help with the oil revenue. On the fiscal front, there's also a lot of things that need to be done on the non-oil side, specifically looking at the VAT, looking at improving the VAT in line with global practices. Improving administration, we have seen multiple, especially at the state and local government level, a lot of multiple taxes which are not even official taxes. So we kind of need that administration reforms to make sure they're harmonized taxes that help not only the people paying them, but also the people collecting them, and they actually go to the government. And then, of course, now we've talked about a lot of macro stability things that the government needs to do over the 6-month period. But we have to remember that once that stability reforms are done, once that level is achieved, we can then start thinking about what can help Nigeria actually grow and reach its potential. It has done so in the past, right? It has reached 7%, 5%. growth rates. It needs to pick those up. And one of those things, and then you have to start focusing on the structural barriers to growth, which are the power sector, your transport sector, other infrastructure, education, health. All of these are structural barriers to growth. And Nigeria needs to focus on them once it has kind of reached that level of stability on the macroeconomic front. And one of the key areas, which is the special chapter of our report actually, is on trade. Trade is also a structural barrier to growth. Allowing trade improvements in trade, allowing traders to import and export more easily can help improve Nigerian growth. And you can read more about that in the report. So this is just us summarizing what the key reforms are. But the thing that we need to focus on is, yes, we want to take all these reforms. These are essential. But the government, to do all these reforms and to continue doing all these reforms, needs to make sure that the people are buying into these reforms. And for that, the government needs to have a compact with its people to make sure that the people of Nigeria are getting basic healthcare, education, even social protection measures, for example, a temporary cash transfer, to make sure that the Nigerian people are front and center of what the policy should be, policy and the reform should be. So as we said, like you could talk about growth, revenue, services, and these are very important, but the essential criteria is to have the people at the center of it all.